Before you decide whether to admire me or despise me, let me ask you one question. How does a boy from a small, recently conquered island, mocked for his accent and ignored by the elite, end up ruling most of Europe and forcing kings to redraw the map of the world? My name is Napoleon Bonaparte, and no, I was not born an emperor, nor did anyone expect me to become one. I was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, a place that had only just become French, which meant that from the very beginning I belonged and did not belong at the same time. My family was of minor nobility, respectable but far from powerful, and my childhood was shaped less by comfort than by ambition and resentment. I spoke French with an accent, my name sounded foreign, and in the military schools of mainland France I was constantly reminded that I was different. I was not popular, I was not charming, and I did not try to be. I read obsessively, studied mathematics and history, and learned very early that war was not about bravery alone, but about calculation, speed, and discipline. Artillery became my weapon of choice because it rewarded precision and intellect rather than noble birth. I quickly realized that in life, being underestimated was sometimes a blessing. People ignored me, laughed at me, and assumed I would never matter. Little did they know I was watching, learning, and planning. When the French Revolution erupted, many saw only chaos and blood, but I saw opportunity. I did not worship the revolution, I used it. Old hierarchies collapsed, and suddenly talent mattered more than lineage, which was fortunate for someone like me. In my early 20s, I found myself promoted rapidly, not because I was loved, but because I was effective. When Paris was threatened by internal revolt, I used cannons to restore order, and that decisive action made my name known. My reputation grew, and I began to understand that war was not just about armies, but about timing, perception, and daring. Soon after, I was given command of the Army of Italy, a force that was underpaid, poorly supplied, and low in morale. I promised my soldiers glory and victory, and unlike many generals, I delivered. Through rapid movement, surprise, and the ability to strike enemy forces separately, I defeated armies that were supposed to be superior to mine. Those campaigns were when I began to believe that my limits were not the same as other men's. My victories were not only military, they were psychological. I understood that a leader's presence, a sharp mind, and a clear plan could turn fear into loyalty. Egypt came next, a bold and risky expedition designed to weaken Britain by striking its interests indirectly. I brought scholars as well as soldiers, and while we learned much about the ancient world, militarily the campaign was flawed. My fleet was destroyed, my army stranded, and eventually I made the controversial decision to return to France, leaving my troops behind. History remembers victories more clearly than explanations, but that moment taught me that ambition without restraint carries a cost. I also discovered that life at the front, far from home, is full of absurdities. I had generals arguing over trivialities, soldiers stealing each other's food, and scholars complaining about sand in their notebooks. France, however, needed stability, and I knew how to provide it. Through a coup that was more calculated than violent, I became first consul, effectively the ruler of France. I centralized administration, reformed finances, reconciled with the church, and created the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that still influences law today. I did not only conquer, I organized. In 1804, I crowned myself emperor, not out of vanity alone, but to show that my authority came from my achievements, not from divine approval. Europe responded with war, and for a time, I answered with victory after victory. Austerlitz was my masterpiece, a battle where planning, deception, and timing aligned perfectly. I loved that feeling when an entire battlefield moved according to my design, as if I were a conductor and armies were my orchestra. At my height, I controlled or influenced much of Europe, and my enemies feared not only my armies but my ideas. Yet power creates its own illusions. In 1812, I invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen, believing that sheer force and reputation would compel submission. Instead, I encountered distance, scorched earth, and winter. Moscow burned, supplies vanished, and retreat became inevitable. That retreat destroyed my army and shattered the myth of my invincibility. After defeat followed exile to Elba, a small island for a man who had ruled an empire. I escaped, returned to France, and for 100 days reclaimed power, driven not by delusion but by unfinished ambition. My final defeat came at Waterloo, not through cowardice or betrayal alone, but through exhaustion, miscalculation, and the combined weight of Europe against me. This time there was no return. I was sent far away, to St. Helena, isolated in the Atlantic, watched carefully, stripped of command, left only with my memories. There I reflected on my life, on how far I had risen and how completely I had fallen. I died in 2021, most likely of stomach cancer, not poison as some legends claim. I was not a monster, nor was I a hero without flaws. I was disciplined, ambitious, ruthless when necessary, and convinced that order was preferable to chaos. I reshaped Europe through war and law alike, and whether I am remembered as a tyrant or a genius depends on who tells the story. But one fact remains undeniable. I began as an outsider from a small island, underestimated by almost everyone, and through will, intellect, and relentless ambition, I forced the world to remember my name. And let me add this, just so you know, being underestimated is a wonderful thing. People ignore you until suddenly, one day, they don't. That day, I made sure the world would never ignore Napoleon Bonaparte again.